Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the Hal Lindsey Report. And now, Hal Lindsey.
Hello, welcome to the Hal Lindsey Report. You know, like many Americans, I've been very concerned about the dollar. So I'm going to give quite a bit of time tonight to go over some history you may not know about the dollar. Until the early part of the 20th century, economic inflation was unheard of in the United States. In terms of purchasing power, the value of the U.S. dollar actually grew by 33% over the 19th century. What cost $1 in 1800 only cost 67 cents 100 years later. But over the course of the 20th century, the purchasing power of a single dollar began to decline. What cost $1 in 1900 cost $21.15 in the year 2000. Over the course of the last 10 decades, the U.S. dollar has been gradually replaced by what is called fiat money, money that is legal tender just because a government declares it to be. Until the Great Depression, the U.S. dollar was based on gold. A dollar was actually redeemable for gold. That meant the supply of dollars was limited to tangible assets possessed by the United States government. And since the supply of gold is finite, it meant that the supply of dollars was finite too. To finance the booming stock market in the 1920s, the Federal Reserve began issuing more dollars than there was gold on hand to back them. When the market crashed in 1929, inflation and the ballooning government deficits put even more money into circulation than there was gold to redeem it. By the way, in 2002, current Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke admitted that the market crash and subsequent depression was actually caused by the Federal Reserve. So to satisfy existing creditors and the Banking Act of 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered all privately held gold to be confiscated. Owners of the gold were compensated with new U.S. Federal Reserve notes, which promised to pay the bearer on demand in lawful U.S. money. The confiscated gold was then held in reserve to back transactions between nations. To finance President Lyndon Johnson's socialistic war on poverty and the Vietnam War, the Fed began printing more money. In the process, it devalued all the rest of the currency in circulation. As the deficits grew, national investors began to dump their dollar holdings. Foreign governments began demanding payment for their dollars with gold. By then, only foreign investors were given that privilege. Now, because of this, in 1971, President Richard Nixon was forced to make a critical decision.
To suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
He crossed the financial Rubicon by severing the link between gold and the dollar altogether. The U.S. defaulted on its payments. In the 1960s, the obligation inscription on Federal Reserve notes was changed again. The former promise to pay the holder with lawful money was replaced with the declaration, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private." The promise to pay became the payment itself. It was backed by nothing of intrinsic value. As a direct consequence, the U.S. economy slipped into a decade-long slide. In 1973, Washington, searching for a way to bolster the dollar's value, cut an ironclad deal with Saudi Arabia. The United States promised to prop up and protect the Saudi regime in exchange for a Saudi pledge to accept only U.S. dollars in payment for its oil sales. Eventually, the rest of OPEC followed suit. The world had to buy oil, and since it could only be purchased with U.S. dollars, the nations and major corporations needed to hold U.S. dollars in reserve. That meant the Fed could go on printing fiat money. For the past 30 years, the U.S. dollar's strength has been primarily based on its role as the world's reserve currency. If you wanted to buy oil, the dollar was as good as gold. Even better, since greenbacks were easier to use. This may explain why U.S. presidents have had an almost inexplicable love affair with the Saudi royal family. The Saudi rulers could virtually do no wrong. They're given deference not afforded to any other national leaders. I've suspected that Gulf War I was staged primarily to protect the Saudi rulers, and most likely, even Gulf War II as well. Of course, it's also been to the advantage of the U.S. to protect our oil supply. Last week, the British newspaper, The Independent, published a startling report. It suggested an international conspiracy to end the dollar's supremacy in the international oil trade. The newspaper reported that officials from Russia, China, Japan, and Brazil had already held secret meetings to discuss plans. Apparently, our old allies, the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, and even France, are on board with the idea too. The various nations involved have all denied the report. But even if it is just speculation, the rumors themselves only fuel the dollar's continuing downward spiral. And now, the United Nations has also begun calling for a new global reserve currency aimed at ending the dollar's supremacy. UN Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Xia Zhukang, said important progress in managing imbalances can be made by reducing the reserve currency countries privileged to run external deficits in order to provide international liquidity. Now, in layman's terms, the international community is getting tired of financing America's standard of living at the expense of their own. World leaders have begun acting on their threats to dump the dollar if the Obama administration doesn't stop living on borrowed money. The president of the World Bank, American Robert Zoellick, recently warned that the U.S. should not take for granted the dollar's status as the world's key reserve currency. In Istanbul, for meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, Zoellick said,
"The old order is gone. We should not waste our time and tears lamenting it. Today we must build anew. Today we can put in place the foundations for a new normal of growth and responsible globalization."
For most of the past decade, the U.S. share of the international currency reserve market has held at roughly 63%. Since the administration began projecting budget deficits running into the trillions of dollars for the next 10 years, the dollar's market share has been cut in half to 37%. Recently, the Bloomberg Financial News has quoted analysts on Wall Street that say developing countries are dumping their dollars in favor of euros. Strategists at the Bank of America say that the current rate is running about $30 billion per month. The printing of all of this new money by the Federal Reserve is having an impact on devaluing each dollar. But that is without all of these other countries that are holding dollars in reserve dumping that money. The minute they start dumping that money, the result could be catastrophic. Reserve currencies become reserve currencies for good reason. They're trusted and are universally acceptable. Sometimes, though, trust slips away, particularly if the nation issuing the reserve currency starts overprinting fiat money and lending it to itself. That's like an individual printing counterfeit money and then borrowing it from himself. Someone is bound to catch on sooner or later. I'll be back after this break.